Welcome back for our second video in our Essential series on the book of Ephesians. In our last video, Colin introduced us to the letter to the Ephesians, starting out with the opening paragraphs. While that video was our introduction to the letter, it is important for us to remember that today's reading is still part of the introduction in the letter itself. Paul has greeted the Ephesians, praised God, and talked about his and the reader's relationship to God. Now, Paul is writing a little bit about his own relationship to the Ephesians. As you read this, I want you to remember that Paul was one of the evangelists who founded the church in Ephesus. It's been a few years by the point that he writes this letter, so he probably didn't know all of the people who would be reading it. But at the same time, when he was writing this letter, broadly speaking, he knows the church in Ephesus personally, and he himself led many of them, especially the leaders of that church, to faith in Jesus. So when he writes to them, and when he writes about his relationship to them, these are very personal words. And like any wise teacher and mentor, he's careful not to neglect to mention the positives. Paul has been hearing good things about the Ephesians. He is thankful for them, and he's praying for them. And that is where we get into the meat of today's reading. As you read through it, I want you to keep in mind that this is Paul's prayer for them, followed up with a little exposition on that prayer. Again, remember that this is not just a vague prayer for strangers who Paul doesn't know but wants to pray for, but a deeply personal prayer for people Paul cares about and probably feels some measure of responsibility for as one of their first spiritual leaders. As you read, ask yourself, why did Paul pray this for them? Paul is a leader in the fledgling church, an apostle who is dedicating his life to serving the church and to spreading the gospel. Why is it then that he is praying these things for the believers, especially ones he knows and cares about personally? Keep that in mind. The first thing that Paul prays for them is that God would give the believers in Ephesus a spirit of wisdom and revelation, or, as some translations have it, the spirit of wisdom and revelation. The text isn't really clear, actually, if this is specifically a prayer for them to be filled anew with the Holy Spirit, or just to have a general spirit of wisdom and revelation. The emphasis, then, is on the wisdom and revelation Paul wants them to have. Why does he want them to have that? For the purposes of knowing God better. He expands on that, asking that God reveal to the Ephesians three things. The first, the hope God is calling them to. The second, the glory of God's inheritance in his people. And finally, the third, the power he gives his people. That is, the power God gives them, not Paul. When Paul lays out a list for us like that, we can be pretty sure that he is going to dive in deeper on those ideas. And he starts out doing that with elaborating on that final one, power. But before I continue, I want to pause for a moment to talk about power. You see, whether we think about it or not, we all operate under and in certain systems of power. For example, kids are under the power of their parents. Employees are under the power, if you will, of their bosses. And then more widely, we are living under certain civil powers. Somebody sets the speed limit that you like to drive faster than. And okay, you might consistently drive faster than that speed limit, but you know when you're doing that, you always know that you run that risk of getting pulled over by the police. Why? Because you are living in and driving under a certain system of power and authority. When you go to vote, you are voting for who you want to be in power, and so on. You get the picture. It was no different then. Okay, they may not have had speed limits for their donkeys and carts or what have you, but they were well aware of the systems of power that they lived in. They knew who was the governor of their territory and who was the emperor of the Roman Empire as a whole. They also knew the soft powers in their area, who had influence in Ephesus, who had influence in their industry, those sorts of powers. But those powers, those physical, relational, obvious ones, aren't the only powers at play in our world and in our lives or in theirs. Paul alludes to here, and later in the letter will directly discuss spiritual powers that influence our world. And it is so important that he does that. They cannot and should not be overlooked. There are spiritual powers, both good and bad, out there that influence our lives and the lives of those around us. There are angels and demons at work in the world around us. And just because we rarely catch glimpses of them doesn't mean they aren't there. With all these powers at play in the world, Paul points out that God exerted incredible power when he raised Jesus from the dead. And it is that same power that is at work within us. Moreover, God placed Jesus above all those powers, visible and invisible, when he raised him from the dead. And God the Father has made Jesus the head of the church. We, you and I, make up his body, the body of the one who has all things under his feet by the decree of the Father. Now that is something to think about.